Everybody seems to hate Facebook, especially the kind of people who actually understand what it means for a company like this to have access to so much data. A company that openly collects and sells data, and then when they get called on it, basically just try to weasel out of it being illegal. Very recently in the news, there was an announcement of another Facebook data leak, and this wasn't a small data leak of like a couple 100,000 records, or maybe even 1 million records. No, no, no. This was 533 million Facebook users' phone numbers and personal data have been leaked online, with 32 million of those being from the US, 11 million being from the UK, and 6 million being from India, with a bunch of other records from basically every other country on Earth that can actually access Facebook. Now, this is a very small part of each of these countries' populations, especially in the case of India, but it's still a massive amount of users who've had their data leaked. Now, as for the data that was actually stolen, as it mentions in the article down here, it includes phone numbers, full names, location, email addresses, and biographical information. Now, the biographical information includes things like the actual bio you set for your profile, your relationship status, your job status, and things like that. While I will be mainly going through articles in this video, I do want to give credit where credit is due. So this dataset was discovered by Alan Gao, who is the CTO of Hudson Rock. Now, Hudson Rock is basically a criminal intelligence organization, and if you want to go directly to the source and see all of the updates they're making about the dataset, check out their Twitter account. The reason why it's in the news now, though, is because this dataset is available online completely for free. Usually a dataset this large is going to cost an absolute insane amount of money, but not anymore. Anyone watching this video, if you know what you're doing, can go and find it. For obvious reasons, I can't show you how to do that or what's in the dataset, but if you know what you're doing, it's very easy to find. Now, the interesting thing about this data leak is it's not actually a new dataset, so according to a Facebook spokesperson, this was actually from a vulnerability that was patched back in 2019. It's unclear whether the dataset was actually from just before the patch was actually made or from an earlier date, but the vulnerability that was actually used to gather the data is no longer there. I do want to be clear about something, and that is the data leak isn't as bad as it could have been. So unlike, say, having an API problem and maybe being able to query for all of the data on an account, or maybe having direct access to the database and being able to do a database dump, what this effectively was an advanced form of web scraping. Among other outlets, Forbes did actually report on this back in 2019. This says Instagram here. Facebook is the parent company of Instagram, and they had the exact same vulnerability. Effectively, what this vulnerability let you do was access profile data that otherwise would have been private. So things like, say, your password weren't actually included in this leak. And also, if you deleted your account before the leak actually occurred, it seems very likely that that data wasn't actually included in the leak either. And while it's not entirely clear at this point, it seems like any private profiles may not have been included as well. Initially, when this hit the news cycle, it wasn't actually free though, but it was cheap enough where it was still a really, really big deal. So the way it worked is you would use this Telegram bot, and you would purchase credits from the bot, and each credit would allow you to look up one record. Now, one credit would cost you $20, but because these hackers understand business, they actually gave you bulk savings if you bought a bunch of credits. So for 5,000 credits, it would have only cost you 10,000. While 10,000 might seem really expensive, if you're running, say, a scam calling company, getting 5,000 known working phone numbers for $2 each is insanely good value. It isn't clear why the dataset was made free after the Vice article came out, because this article actually came out back on the 26th of March. I have a couple of theories for it. So one of them is the person running the bot has made a ton of money from it and just ran off with the money rather than continuing to run it and potentially being caught. And my other theory is that now that Vice did their article, a couple of other journalists will start looking into it, and then if you want to do as much damage to Facebook as possible, you might as well just release the entire dataset, and then everyone will start talking about it. Now, while 2 years is enough for things like your bio, relationship status, and job status to all completely change, things like your full name, birth date, location, email, phone number, All of these things are very likely still in use even today. Maybe even in the case of Mark Zuckerberg. So unsurprisingly, the people who actually exploited the vulnerability made sure that Zuckerberg's information was actually a part of the dataset. I have no evidence of this, but I would have to say he's probably not using this phone number anymore, and it wasn't just his information that was taken. The other co-founders of the company were also a part of the dataset as well. You may be wondering what this data could actually be used for, so you should just assume that every single phone number and email address, along with its associated full name, is going to be a part of every single spam database in existence, because the way it's normally handled is you just cycle through the possible results until you find someone who actually answers. And if you know that these phone numbers and email addresses actually work and you know who is actually running it, you can actually include that person's name and make it seem like you're actually doing something legitimate. There has been some minor reporting of increased spam calls since the database actually came out, but there isn't any hard evidence of this actually occurring. As for the bioinformation, this can be used for things like impersonation and fraud, along with making it easier to do things like dictionary attacks, because there's a lot of people who use basic information about themselves inside of their password, whether that be their pet's name or the school they went to, their parents' maiden name, anything like that. All of that information is going to be used to strengthen these attacks. Now that the data is public, there's not really much that can be done. Obviously, you can do things like change your phone number and disconnect any accounts from the same email address as your Facebook account, but for things like your location and your full name, there's nothing you can do here. But unless you're really, really worried, I wouldn't bother changing that information anyway. Really, what should be happening now is Facebook should be going through the entire dataset and inform every single affected user and telling them what data was actually leaked and what steps they could potentially take to mitigate the damage. This wouldn't be very difficult for Facebook to do because every single row in the dataset also has your Facebook account ID attached to it as well. And from what I understand, they haven't done anything of the sort. It's just been, let the news handle it and we'll just sort of forget about that happening and let the news cycle move on to something else. But I'm going to give Facebook the benefit of the doubt when it comes to their security. I'm going to say that they hire the best security staff in the world, and their platform is just the most secure thing. Obviously, that's not the case, but just follow along with what I'm saying. No system, even the most secure system in the world, is going to be perfect. And Facebook is one of the largest targets, if not the largest target in the world, with 2.6 billion users. Most of the attacks aren't going to be reported on, but Facebook is going to be under constant attack, and people are going to be constantly looking for new vulnerabilities. So be very careful what you share with a website like Facebook. And this isn't just the case for Facebook, because even very small websites have vulnerabilities in them, and someone will exploit them. So be very careful what private information you actually put on the internet. Now, this data leak came at a hilarious time in Australia because the Australian government has a great idea. They want to make it so everybody has to give their IDs to social media companies, because that's obviously going to be a completely great idea. Basically, what they're trying to do is outlaw anonymous social media. This isn't the first time the Australian government has done something insane. They also want to make it so that if your service has encryption, you have to build in a backdoor for the government, which I will cover in a whole nother video why that's a horrendous idea. But the reason why they want to get rid of anonymous social media is to address things like online bullying and sexual harassment. You know, the typical things that are used to basically steal away your freedoms. And if you don't understand how Australian ID works, basically 100 points will equate to your birth certificate and let's say your driver's license. So that would be 140 points. Or say your birth certificate and your house loan, I believe, would be 100 points, and there's a bunch of other things in here you can use as well. Basically, really important identification documents. And besides this not actually stopping anything, because, you know, a VPN exists and I can just make my account in another country, and being very impractical for startups, being forced to ID every single Australian user, it would also basically outlaw whistleblowing, because if you do something illegal, your account and the ID associated with it would have to be passed on to the government. Now, the reason why I bring this up is, what about when Facebook has another data leak? It's not a question of if they'll have a data leak, it's definitely when, because unless they shut down tomorrow, sometime in the future, there will be another one. What's going to happen if it's actually a really big data leak and whoever actually exploits the vulnerability gets access to the Australian user's ID documents? So if you have 100 points of ID, that is enough to ruin someone's life, because 100 points of ID is what you need to reissue an ID document. And once you can reissue documents, well, now you actually have physical copies. And once you have access to someone else's IDs, you can do any number of things to that person. Australia isn't the first country to suggest this, but like with the countries that have done it before, it's still a really, really bad idea. Now, back to the main point. If you want to find out if your data has been leaked, the dataset has been added into Have I Been Pwned. Have I Been Pwned is an absolutely amazing service. If you've never used it before, basically, you enter your email address, and then it will compare that email address against all of the datasets it has access to, and then it will compare that email address against all of the datasets it has access to, and tell you if your account has been compromised on any of those services. There is a slight problem with the dataset, though, and that is that the phone number is more common than the email, so you may still actually be in the dataset even if your email address isn't present. The creator of Have I Been Pwned, Troy Hunt, is trying to decide on how to actually handle this, whether he actually wants to add phone numbers into the search or how else it could possibly be done. When I searched for my email address earlier, it wasn't actually there, but the rest of my data could still very well be in the dataset. So hopefully no one watching this video has had their data leaked, but considering that it's like a 1 in 5 shot of it happening, it's quite likely that some of you have actually been affected. So I think that's going to be everything for me, but before I go, I would like to thank my supporters. So a special thank you to Chris, Joachim, Donald, Michael, Andre, Nathan, David, Montezar, Will, Brennan, Chico Bento, Jamie, Joseph, Mitchell, Peter D, Stephen, Tony Tushar, and all of my $2 supporters. If you'd like to go support my work, there'll be links down below to my Patreon, Subscribe Star, LibrePay, all that sort of stuff. I've got my podcast, Tech Over Tea, available basically anywhere, and then this channel is available on Odyssey and BitChute if you want to watch my content on a platform that isn't YouTube. So I think that's pretty much everything for me, and I'm out.